Good morning, everyone. So I'm not exactly sure what to do here because I don't know how much everybody knows about community-based participatory research. So I'll just start by saying a little bit about what I think it is, what I understand it to be. So I'll say a bit about what I understand community-based participatory research to be. The research that I do is in low-income communities, and so I see this kind of research as being about working with low-income people, and working with, I think, is the key thing. And ideally, working with poor people in every way. That is, what is the research that is going to be done? What are the research questions? I don't determine that as an academic. That comes from the community. How will that research question be studied? Who will do the work? And related to that is, those cases where we have research grants and we're going to hire research assistants, hiring locally, hiring people from the community, training them to do the research. My experience is that that can be extremely empowering. And who will write? And how will that whole process work? That can be quite a complicated part of community-based participatory research. So those are the key things. The research, everything about it is coming from the community. I think that there can be various permutations and combinations of that. I don't think it has to be pure. It doesn't have to be perfectly aligned with that model. Typically, research opportunities arise in a low-income community, and you try to tailor the method to the realities on the ground as best you can. But you're aiming for working with the community. As Brenda said, and as Indigenous people in Winnipeg's inner city say all the time, it's all about relationships. It's all about building relationships. And as Michelle said, using a language by which we understand each other. And I take language, very broadly there. Oftentimes, people in the academic world and people in low-income communities really use different languages in every respect. So trying to bridge those. What are the strengths of community-based participatory research? Well, those who are living in poverty, experiencing poverty, are the experts. I think that's the fundamental principle of all of this. And their expertise derives from their experiential knowledge, and that experiential knowledge is something that can't be had in the library. It can't be had, for the most part, from books. That experiential knowledge is a treasure. And the other side of that coin is that this kind of research is not imposing from the outside. There is, of course, a long history in the Indigenous community and outside the Indigenous community of so-called experts coming from the outside, often white, middle-class, university-based or corporate-based, doing what they think is appropriate and really not solving any problems and not leaving anything very positive behind. So a key strength of this kind of research is building community, working with community, relying upon local experiential knowledge. What are its weaknesses? There are a couple of weaknesses in my view. One is that it may not be possible in lots of cases to be as critical as might be warranted, particularly given the need for community approval of the things that are written. Brenda said when she was speaking here this morning, are you there to please somebody? And that can be an issue in doing community-based participatory research. In my view, it may not be possible using this kind of research, or at least it's a challenge using this kind of research, to be as creative as might be necessary. One of the things that I have experienced in working in Winnipeg's inner city, Winnipeg's North End, is that people who have lived in poverty often have a very narrow worldview. So they know what the challenges are that they're experiencing and have a sense of what kinds of solutions. But I think that's a role that academics might be able to play, is to try to translate that into something more creative. And I don't think this kind of research should be seen as the only kind of research. There's other kinds of research that can be done and ought to be done as well. So there are some weaknesses. On balance, I would say this kind of research is much better than that which has typically and historically been done by outside experts. I think there are many, many weaknesses with that. I just spoke the other day to a group of sort of elderly like myself, people, and they have no connection whatever with the inner city. I was talking about the inner city, and they came up afterwards and said they want to go for coffee. They've got an idea about what to do and so on. So this is well intentioned, but it's not the right approach in my view. I think community-based participatory research is much more likely to produce something that's meaningful, something that is useful to the community, and in my view, that's a big part of the purpose, to leave something useful behind.
I agree with everything that Jim said, but I was thinking about, because part of it says, what's your journey through the community research, and so I was thinking back when I first connected with community and how my understanding of working with community has evolved. And I remember, I was trying to figure out the year by the birth of my son. So I think it was 77 or something. Doing some work with the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, going up to Alaska, not speaking to one Alaskan member of those corporations, just getting some annual reports. So, but my intention was to try to understand what was going on from an economic perspective. That's the area that I get up in the morning and go, yeah, I'm so happy I'm doing this. So, so that was sort of how I started doing research. The idea that Jim expressed of trying to make a difference, but just in my master's work, just not exactly quite there. But then I did some work with communities in a different way, and I'm not sure if it's a permutation, maybe it's something totally different, but the way that I look at economic development, I guess, is the same way that I look at research. They're pieces of the puzzle. And the piece of the puzzle that I wanted to explore was individual Indigenous businesses and business owners, why they did what they did, what they loved about it. And so I came in with the idea and said, I hear you're a success. I hear you're a success. How do you sort of probably want to react to me? Oh, let me tell you all about my story. People that are working so hard in business, small business especially, I mean, that's what they want to do. And so I connected with individuals with the idea that communities might be impacted by sharing the stories and maybe encouraging, other people to think about that. And for my dissertation, it was sort of along the same lines, but the question was, how does community make decisions, economic decisions? So it was a kind of a broader thing, but I was still taking the question into the community, but it actually turned out to be a question that they want answered, so worked out for both of us. The last, I think I have 5 years in the book, but I think it was 6 years for, it was Poverty Action Research Project, where, again, it was an interesting process. 5 communities across Canada, and we're looking at poverty and what can we do so that economic activity can perhaps result from change. So the funding request went in to CIHR. I'm sorry, what's that acronym mean? Okay, there you go. Health. I'm not in that area. So it's health research. Anyway, okay, so in order to get the funds, But then we went out and invited all the communities, the First Nation communities across Canada through Assembly First Nations, which was who was our partner, to consider being part of this work, so this project. So they chose. And then we totally did everything that they guided us to. So I think then I was really in that community-based participatory research. And it was really an interesting project and a really interesting experience, much different than what I had had before when I was in control a bit differently, because I came in with the question, right? So I wasn't really asking, I asked everybody a set of questions, but then, of course, like any interview, it evolves and, what goes whichever way the speaker wants it to. So there was some input, I guess, into the research, but it was exhilarating, it was frustrating, it was exhilarating, it was frustrating, and the core of community people that stuck it out, like, were just, so totally awesome, because it was a 4.5-hour drive from Winnipeg to go up there, and go up on a Sunday, and they'd spend their Sunday a couple hours with us, and then, we try to move forward. We had a community coordinator. But I'm not going to say anything more about that. You have to come tomorrow at 1:15 to my lecture, because that's what it's all about. But I just say it was really interesting. It was a very interesting experience, and really tried to reflect 10 academics across Canada about the experiences that were so totally different in our communities, and what that really meant as academics, as researchers, and then as people within this, community of Canada.
So for me, community-based research is an opportunity to use research to advance the knowledge in community, to bring together the diversity of knowledges that are out there and to make sense of an issue. So I am, unlike my colleagues here, not a doctor. I'm working in the community right now. But I began working as a researcher and diversity education consultant in community-based research some years ago when I was employed by an organization called Prairie Women's Health Center of Excellence, which was forced to close its doors in 2013 due to the anti-feminist ideologies of the then Stephen Harper regime. Prairie Women's Health foundational work in CBR was both groundbreaking and meaningful as we moved the needle forward on a number of different strategies and policies in women's health, in particularly rooted in the prairies, and as they pertain to the social determinants of health. So working in partnership, working in a committed way with community, and working and valuing diversity of background and lived experience were the main attributes of that research that was produced at that time. From that time onwards, I've always valued the work of well-executed CBR, so community-based research. I'm currently the executive director of an organization in Saskatoon called Shep Good Food, which works to promote food security and provide a number of services and programs in the community, ranging from school nutrition to community gardening to fresh food markets. And simultaneously, I'm also the co-manager of a building called Station 20 West, which is a community enterprise center located in the core neighborhood of Saskatoon. Both Shep and Station 20 West are currently engaged and have been involved in a number of different CBR experiences. Many of these have benefited the organizations, I think, providing us with evaluation of services, greater understanding of how our work is impacting the communities, in particular the communities that are represented most strongly within the core, to which we're designed to serve. And so some of those CBR experiences have not gone as well. Research that was not responsive to our needs as an organization, research that died out due to a lack of steam, whether it was the researcher, whether it was the participants and foresight. And there's a whole backstory and narrative to a lot of those. And research that didn't provide recognition to the people who contributed to it. And I bring this up only to say that even the best of intentions on the part of researchers doesn't always pan out as one would hope from a participant point of view. For those in the room who are unfamiliar with Station 20 West, there are 7 co-locating organizations that live inside that building and work inside that building. So the Health Authority, this used to be Saskatoon Health Region, but now morphed into the Saskatchewan Health Authority. They have a Building Health Equity Office. Quint Development is responsible for housing and job creation. Elizabeth Fry Society, a volunteer-run Saskatoon Mothers Centre. Kids First Early Childhood Development Support Organization. Chep Good Food. And lastly, the U of S Community Engagement Office, which helps to facilitate community-based research in the core neighborhoods. Researchers and students in that center are able to use a desk in the engagement office, receive support from the manager of the office, Lisa Erickson, and in many regards feel a sense of community of practice with others using that space. And I think it's very important as a part of CBR to have mentors in the field as well as base camp within the community of which you're working. Researchers are able to interact with community members and organizations and learn a bit more how daily reality plays out in the core neighborhood by spending time in that space. As a community, it's never stagnant. CBR continues to be an emerging and adapting methodology, I think. And if I could have a wish for emerging researchers in this field, it would be to represent the community well. Promote diverse participants to receive a sense of agency from the work. After all, it's their story. And commit to moving the needle forward on action so that the research is really intended to move it up. And I think that we're in a sense of, worldwide, we're in a sense of urgency around moving community-based research into action as deliberate as we need to. And I would just probably end my talk with nothing about us without us. So if you are going to community, if you are engaging with people, it's their story and they need to be represented in all aspects of it, whether it's from development of the question, involvement in the research, and authorship, etc. So really it has to be rooted in the people of which you are working with.
My name is Joanne Lee. I want to start by telling a story about what happened just last term in my class. I've been teaching at the University of Victoria for many years and I'm planning to retire next year. And I was sitting in the class and I looked at one of the girls in my class and thought she looked strangely familiar. And I didn't think about it because I'm really good with faces but bad with names. I don't know if you can relate to that. But weeks went by and finally she came up to me and she said, "Dr. Lee, I don't know if you remember me." And I said, "Yeah, I kind of remember you. I think I know you." And she said, "I was 9 years old when I first met you. And I met you in your first research project, and I'm part of Antidote. And do you remember my sister?" And I said, "Yeah, I remember your sister really well. I remember your whole family." And she said she started the Moose Hide campaign. I don't know if any of you know that campaign. It's an anti-violence campaign. And I thought, "Oh my God." And she said, "Yeah, I think you started us on that journey." And I thought, wow. And that was the best kind of, when I think about PAR and I get a story that's so powerful, when it hits you like that, then you think, yeah, PAR made a difference. And so I wanted to start with that, just in case you think I'm being overly critical. Because what I'm really wanting to share with you is I've been doing PAR-type work with racialized and Indigenous girls and young women for a long time. So I've actually seen an arc, and maybe standing from where I am today, I can describe that arc to you. So I just also want to just ask you to just turn around and look at each other and just, if you identify as being, having any experiences as being a racialized or an Indigenous girl or young woman growing up in an urban center, just raise your hand if you can relate to that position. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, well that really, that's the situation that I was confronted with. In this entire room, there were like 3 or 4 people who put up their hands. So when I started to do this work, it really began really powerfully in my office when a student came to me and she burst into tears and she said, "I've never had a teacher like you before. What you said really caused me to really rethink who I am and how I've come to know myself. And I find it really traumatic." And so anyways, we sat and talked. And those of you who are minorities in university settings will probably know what that emotional labor of supporting minority students feels like. They come to you, they find you, and they share their stories with you. And sometimes their stories are really hard to hear. So that started me off on my first SSHRC grant, and I didn't use PAR at that time. It was a very traditional, we did interviews, we did a survey, we did focus groups, and we ran like I think 12 or 13 focus groups with girls from particular ethnic, national, or religious minority communities. And the work I do is in Victoria, BC. And how many of you have been to Victoria, BC? Okay, so many of you know that the symbols of colonialism, British colonialism, is everywhere around you, and it's predominantly a white city, where the rest of the province is somewhere up to about 20% diverse, visible minorities. When I was doing the work, when I first started doing the work, it was down in Victoria to around 6%, so 8%, 6 to 8%. So if you can imagine, that's the kind of place setting my work took place. So one of the things that I wanted to begin there. Now, one of the things I want to share with you is to think critically, and Brenda asked us to think critically always, to be aware and alert always to how language works. And I want to go back to some of the descriptions of participatory action research. And as Jim says, you know, when it started, it was an alternative, a real exciting alternative to the kind of traditional Enlightenment, positivistic, modern, liberal depictions of how we produce knowledge. It was objective, it was really following a male-centered logic, etc., etc., etc. And so it was very exciting to think that community could produce knowledge for itself about its own problems. And so still we present and we talk about participatory action research in this excited, celebratory, passionate way. We are very evangelical about it. But after all these years, there's a lot about participatory action research discourse that invades our conceptions of what we're doing and maybe blinds and hides us to the reality of its effects on both ourselves and on the people and communities that we're working with. And so I kind of want to just highlight a few ideas there. So one of the things that we usually say is that we work with community, and we say that the group takes ownership, they produce the research questions. The research questions aren't predetermined, they're emergent, etc. The idea is, and I'm quoting Susan Smith here, the group's process of action, reflection, praxis strips away the veneer of life circumstances, revealing the foundations of why things are the way they are. And elsewhere, then she quotes John Gaventa, another big person in PAR. PAR is about personal and social transformation, for the liberation of oppressed people. It is about creating knowledge simultaneously as a tool for the education and development of consciousness as well as mobilization. So you can just hear, I think, in these descriptions of what PAR is, this kind of triumphalism, that we can get together and we can be revolutionary and transform the world. Am I only getting this? Are you following me? Are you following me on this? So a couple of things in these kinds of descriptions are apparent. That somewhere there is a group that comes together and collectively kind of works with you, the researcher, who is supposed to be outside from the community, kind of apart and outside and probably above the community. And that there's a kind of leveling that's supposed to take place, a kind of collectivity, that's action that takes place, and that there is a reality, somehow a truth that is to be discovered. And so I want to question that. I'm wondering, in that kind of description of what PAR is, does it really address colonization and the legacy of colonization? Does it really address white racist nation-state formation? Where if we brought those ideas into place, we would really immediately recognize that only some groups of people are allowed to form collectivities. Only some groups of people are allowed to form communities. Only some groups of people are allowed to groupify, to be made into groups. Only some groups of people, some populations, are allowed to access state resources. Only some groups of people have access to cultural knowledge and practices, skills, etc., to be able to use whatever tools they have to express themselves. So already there is a hierarchy. And the idea of community as something natural and organic that just exists out there, that has a kind of an animated spirit that we just have to activate, I think that's a big fat lie. I think the reality of what I have dealt with in doing the work that I do with racialized and indigenous girls and young women in white hegemonic urban centers is that they are erased, they are invisible, and they are silenced. And when you go in to do this kind of work that I did, I was told that they did not exist, even though they were visible. Even though they were visible as a minority population, they were still there. But the work of building community, that had to take place before any participatory action research could be undertaken. So what I've learned is that participatory action research, one of the action that it supports, and also it's kind of a prerequisite for doing PAR, is community development. And so many of the panelists have talked about the legacy of doing their work, and that the legacy has been to create organizations, make a structural change in the place in which they're doing their work. And so that's another thing that I wanted to leave you with, this idea of place. All participatory action research is place-based. And so we have to look at the geopolitical, economic, cultural power dynamics that gets to define place and who belongs in that place, and how place affects identity. And increasingly, I think that we can no longer privilege the local in PAR. And the work that I've been doing with immigrant girls and young women, the global and local are absolutely connected. And so people don't hold a single identity or subjectivity from which they can speak of their experience. They have multiple identities. It's shifting and changing all the time. And it's not just in a progressive way. It could be simultaneously and instantaneous. So the idea of getting people to speak their truths, what truth? Under what conditions and contexts? How does power operate to mediate this sense of identity and language and stories that are being told? So I've run out of time, but those are some of the kind of thoughts that I want to leave you with, is that many of your students and reading this literature for the first time, really ask yourself, does it really take into consideration the issues that we're dealing with today, contemporary issues that we're dealing with today, globalization, decolonization, white nation state formation. Leave it there.
Your goal was to make the most amount of time for conversation, right? So I believe we have about 45 minutes right now for that, or 40 minutes or so. So I think what we might do is take a couple of questions at a time, and then that allows them to answer the question collaboratively too. So if you can make your question to a particular panelist, but everybody might take a bite at it. Okay, Naren, I can see you're ready to go.
Of course.
Yeah. Naren, go ahead.
So I'm just a very broad one. I'm hearing the terms community-based research and participatory action research used interchangeably, but I have a sense that maybe they're not quite. I know historically I'm familiar with PAR as a term, and CBR has emerged recently. Can you comment on that? There might be Are they interchangeable?
Should we respond?
I'll take a couple more questions. And why don't we do one more, because I have a feeling that could be a longer question. Is there one more question? Yep, go ahead. Yep. Yes. Hi.
Well, actually, after Dr. Lee was talking, I was wondering if she ever considered online communities and like online places, because she was talking about how it's like place-based, but in a lot of ways we have these interesting online communities that come together and have very much their own language and culture that based around that sort of experience.
Good. Okay, we've got two there. Why don't we start with two, and then we'll kind of build from that. So first question is on community-based research and participatory action research. And then the second one is the online in real life kind of question. Okay. I'll turn it over to the panelists, whoever would like to kick us off.
Should I start? Well, community-based research, I think, is a more recent term, and it's, I think it really is an academic to distinguish between the former way of thinking about research, which is university-based research, versus a range of new approaches that are lodged in the community, where researchers are working with outside of the university, not in their ivory tower. So it's very, very broad. And another term that's related to that is community-engaged research and community-university partnerships. So it's a kind of big paradigm, I think, to distinguish it from the old traditional style of ivory tower type research. And PAR, I really think PAR is both an ideology and a tool.
Just one thought. In the work that we were doing with Indigenous communities across Canada, the result was to meaningfully acknowledge Indigenous partners as nations, not stakeholders, with jurisdiction over research in their communities and on their traditional territories. So it was a radically shift or inversion of the balance of power. So I guess I'm talking Indigenous because it was an Indigenous project, but I think that there's still some value to carry over into other communities. I think the online community is really interesting because I'm starting to explore that now in another project, of which I have not much technical things happening, but I just think it's really cool because people are finding that a place to be able to express themselves. So yeah, so I guess that's all I would add.
On the online question that you posed, I've not done any research on online communities, but then I think one way we might want to think about it is that it's place-making in the same, and it's place-located. So we actually have to look at online communities as a place where power is also circulating. And so the same kind of misogyny, violence, racism that occurs in real life is also there. Yeah. So powers that weren't there, and I think just as in kind of physical place-based power, we also have to pay attention to how power is working there. It's not a neutral space. This whole idea of net neutrality, excuse me? Have you looked at the trolling comments?
Et cetera, and et cetera.
I do want to comment though that I think that online platforms do offer some folks who otherwise wouldn't have a voice in other areas of the community an opportunity to engage differently with folks. And so Facebook as being one of the really common ones that I think a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't have an opportunity to receive information or to engage in some level of discourse, I think are really important for a lot of people. And I know that, like in Saskatoon, you know, when we're transferring information about a particular event, about some kind of, it can easily spiral off into, you know, sort of sub-conversations, which I find fascinating actually, to see where people, you know, where people go in their minds. But you're right, it's not neutral. It's not neutral space at all. And I know that there have been people that have been, you know, bullied, cyberbullied through that site as well. So it's kind of a new thing, I think, for us to try to grapple with how to respond effectively and make sense of.
Okay, I see Trisha's hand. We're going to do 2 sets of questions again this round. I might throw a question in as well. Trish, what was your question?
In the history of action research, I mean, it sort of started outside the university in the 60s and 70s where it really started to get some traction.
Can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I'm asking about sort of the roots of action research outside the university in the 60s and 70s, and it's slowly sort of, and even the academics who were working on it then were doing it largely outside the university. And now it's been sort of absorbed into the institution, there's some funding behind it, there's different organizations. And I'm wondering if any of you want to reflect on that kind of transformation of it becoming a bit more institutionally absorbed and, you know, positives and negatives to that.
Okay, so that's the first question there around, just in case folks can't hear in the back, how this type of research has morphed since the 60s and 70s into something that some might say is being absorbed very significantly through institutionalization and neoliberal things. I will not further comment. I'll turn it over to the panelists. I might throw in a couple comments on that one. But can we get one other question from the audience as well? Anybody maybe on this side of the room? I'll come back. Is there one more question here? Yeah, go ahead, Lynn.
Most of the people in this room are from community-based organizations. And so the question I pose to everybody on the panel, but in particular to Yvonne, what's the one piece of advice that you would have to organizations if they are approached by somebody at the university wanting to do research? What should they ask, and what are the things that they should be wary of and perhaps excited about?
Okay, good. So we have kind of 2 sets of questions.
The things that I would say for academics coming to community organizations interested with an idea or how to improve things, or maybe they've had a conversation at an earlier time with an organization, is that there is a dance of reciprocity that's really necessary. So for whatever is going to work, you know, for academics to get grants, to see that, you know, those go forward and work with a community organization as a partner. What does partnership really mean to you? What is the role of collaborative practice? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, you will burn a lot of bridges within the CBO world if you are unresponsive to a community's needs and also the organization's staff perhaps, or participants that are involved with that CBO. If in fact you are dragging your heels, not getting back communication-wise, and not listening to the organization as a whole in what its desires for being involved with that research really are. And I think that that's a real pitfall that we have seen a number of different times, is that we get called upon to be part of research, and then there's like this long gap in time where we don't really know. Who really knows what's going on with the academic researcher that's been assigned to that particular project. And so, I know that there's lit reviews involved. I know that there's sort of groundbreaking, there's ethical reviews, all that kind of stuff. But I think that it's really important to keep communication lines open with the CBO in order that people know that there's actually movement going forward. And then I think that one of the things that burns me the most is that there is no recognition of the CBO or the participants that are involved. It's so unfair, it's so unethical, it's so disapproving of the whole research methodology as a whole to take authorship, to maybe have a tiny little note at the bottom of a journal article, thanks to blah, blah, blah organization. It's kind of a slap in the face to the participants. So I really encourage you to figure out ways to involve and engage and recognize the people that have given you their time and their stories, of which you are working your way up in the academic world. So, I mean, those are a few thoughts that I have. There's many more, actually. So come to my session on Tuesday.
One tip I would give you, if you're the ED of a community organization and you're approached, you should look at the person's CV and you should look at their track record. Have they ever sat on any community board before? Have they ever directed any funding to a community organization before? Look at their track record. How successful are they in getting money? You're struggling to pay the salaries of your staff. You know, you've got way more work than you can manage. It takes time and effort for the volunteers and for the staff to support a research project. Does this person get this? So really interrogate the CV, interview the researcher who's approaching you, and if they don't meet the standards that you set in terms of track record and experience and knowledge, it's not worth it for you to get involved. It's not sexy. You can hire somebody to produce a documentary video. You can hire somebody and get a grant yourself. You don't need the researcher. The researcher needs you more than you need them.
I think genuine success in doing that. A significant number of the leaders in the inner city today are people who, at an earlier stage in their lives, we hired as community-based researchers and trained, and they learned some skills, but more than that, I think developed some confidence in themselves, which is frequently a problem in the inner city. So I could identify, a number of individuals for whom hiring them as research assistants has been significant. And then, as I said in response to the last question, I believe in trying to use the research to build institutions, and then for those institutions to use community development principles, a fundamental one of which is hire locally, hire local people. So if you in Selkirk Park, we created a childcare center. To the extent possible, the childcare workers there are hired locally and encouraged to get further training to develop their skills beyond where they are. We established a resource center. The women who work there, now one man as well, are local people.